All right. Good evening, everybody. Welcome to our weekly New York Giants Preservation Society meeting. Today we have author and big-time Giant fan Dan Fost. Dan is going to be speaking to us. He lives in California, but he's on the East Coast this week visiting some family. For those who have never seen the book before, The Giants Baseball Experience, great coffee table book going over the Giants' entire franchise up until the 2013 season. So it does not include the 2014 season, but Dan will be discussing that. Next week we have Terry Cashman talking baseball, baseball balladeer, also prolific songwriter. Wrote Spanky and Our Gang, Sunday Will Never Be the Same. I mean, just a big time writer. After that, we have Mel Ott's daughter the following week. And then the following week after that, some of us are going on a tour of the historic places at the Polo Grounds, and the Mets will be in town to face the Giants. So without further ado, Dan, welcome to the New York Giants Preservation Society meeting. I think we'd have more people had the Giants not been coming back in the ninth inning to take this, hopefully take the game. We'll see what happens. But Dan, the floor is yours. Welcome to our meeting.
Thank you, Gary, and thanks to all of you for actually showing up in the middle of an exciting Giants game. I mean, who even knew this year was going to be as great as it's been? And so it's, and now it's like they're never out of it, no matter how many runs they're down in the ninth inning. So it's just really fun. I don't for watching that instead of watching me, but I think we can have some fun too. I told Gary, pegging it to this book, and this book has been out of print for a few years. You can still find it, hopefully at a discount online on eBay or on or other sites where used books are sold. Often, sometimes in pretty good condition, and sometimes I've even bought some that it turns out I had signed for somebody. But it's so I'm not really, or if you want help or you want to sign it or you have a copy that you want to sign, just get in touch with me and I'm happy to send you a book plate and put that in there. But I told Gary with this book as the peg, I thought maybe we could talk about what were the greatest decades in Giants history, because we kind of broke this book into discrete decades and looked at the team through that lens. When I first started writing about the Giants, I had been a longtime reporter at the San Francisco Chronicle, but not a sports writer. And I left the paper in 2007 and wrote an article for San Francisco Magazine that ran in 2008 on the 50th anniversary of the team's moving to San Francisco, which I know is a dark day for some of the folks in this group, but we called that story The Lords of No Rings. And we looked at the question of whether the Giants were just as cursed as the Cubs and the Red Sox, those teams that were legendary for failing to win the big one. People in San Francisco just didn't seem to realize that at that time, the Giants had never won a World Series in the city by the Bay. They had instead seemed to have inherited a legacy of heartbreak from their predecessors in New York and taken it to the next level. In New York, you had Merkel's boner and Snodgrass's muff. San Francisco had McCovey's line drive, Dusty Baker taking the ball from Russ Ortiz, Jose Cruz Jr.'s gold glove turning to brick in the 2003 playoffs, an earthquake, so many other disastrous moments for the Giants. So from that article, I wrote a book, Giants Past and Present, which came out in April 2010. And amazingly and improbably, that year's team launched a new era in Giants baseball. Bruce Bochy and his band of cast-offs and misfits, with rookies Buster Posey and Madison Bumgarner, and the lights-out pitching staff led by Tim Lincecum and Matt Cain. They broke the schneid and brought home the World Series trophy for the first time since 1954. And since then, of course, they've won two more even year championships, 2012 and 2014. I got to update my book twice. And then I wrote this second book, The Giants Baseball Experience, which was a year-by-year look with all kinds of great artwork. And now here we are with this new group of cast-offs and misfits, and still with Buster Posey behind the plate. And once again, we're hoping for another miracle by the Bay. So in looking at, in thinking about those 10 years, 11 years now since that my book came out, could that have been the best decade in Giants history? And I was thinking, how do we rank the decades? Do we look at World Series victories or pennants or by their won-loss records? And depending on which of those metrics you choose, you could come up with different teams. So, I'm picking a decade from New York and one from San Francisco. And the San Francisco team, of course, is the 2010s with those 3 titles. We, and I have to confess, as I started thinking about this talk and I did some research, and my son, who's also a huge fan, helped me out. And I breathed a sigh of relief when I discovered recently that the Giants finished that decade with a winning record, despite 3 straight losing seasons at the end. 2020 made it 4 straight losing seasons. They were only 2 games under 500 that year, but I always think of it as 4.5 losing seasons because of that epic meltdown after the All-Star game in 2016, when they had the best record in baseball before the game and the worst after it. So for the 2010s, the Giants finished with 821 wins, 799 losses, a 507 winning percentage, 4 playoff appearances, a 679 record in playoff games. I mean, until that 2016 series with the Cubs, Bruce Bochy had never lost a playoff series, including wild card games, as the Giants skipper. And they had those 3 precious, long-awaited World Series championships. It's always been hard. That'd be a whole other talk. We could talk about which one is your favorite. I'm partial to 2010 for the way the Giants had never won one, and they broke the curse, and they did it with that whole mantra of torture. But then in 2012, when they had their backs to the wall so many times and they just would never say die and came back first against the Reds and then the Cardinals, and then sweeping the Tigers, and then that incredible 2014 postseason where they seemed to be held together with duct tape and baling wire and Madison Bumgarner's epic series, including that Game 7 performance. I don't know that we'll ever see that again. Before the 2010s, we had in the aughts, we had the Barry Bonds steroids era Giants logging more wins and a higher winning percentage, 855 wins and a 529 percentage, but they went 12-13 in 3 postseasons, including those mega meltdowns in 2002 and 2003, which I think of as forgiven but not forgotten. 2010, the 2010s have redeemed those only so much. I still love Dusty Baker. He still seems to have one more good shot at a title with this year's Astros. But of course, I cannot possibly root for the Astros, especially after 2017. And I don't think we really have to worry because I think Dusty can only get a team so far. But I will always love the guy for helping turn around the Giants. A turnaround really began with Roger Craig and the Hum Babies, Will Clark, Matt Williams, Robbie Thompson in the late 80s. And then, of course, Barry Bonds came in 93 and the new ownership, and Dusty Baker took over as manager. Of course, that was another one of those heartbreaking years where they won 103 games, but it was before the wild card existed, just the year before, and they did not even make a postseason. The only San Francisco decade that I think could give the Giants, the 2010s, some real competition would have to be the 60s, because there were a lot of dark years in the 70s and 80s, but in the 60s, and sure, the Giants had 2 postseason berths in the 80s and the aughts, including a pennant in each. And the 80s had Will the Thrill, they had Kruk and Kipe in uniform. We had Big Daddy Russell and Kevin Mitchell winning an MVP with 47 home runs and a barehanded catch in the outfield. And the aughts had Bonds with those otherworldly blasts into McCovey Cove, JT Snow scooping up little Darren Baker, and just even having that new ballpark by the bay has been wonderful. But the 1960s had Willie Mays, the greatest of all time, Giant or otherwise. And it's no coincidence that Oracle Park now is ringed by statues of Mays, Willie McCovey, Juan Marichal, Gaylord Perry, and Orlando Cepeda, the decade stars, Hall of Famers all. McCovey told me in an interview that he wasn't even that disappointed when he lined out with the tying and winning runs on base in Game 7 of the 1962 World Series, because the Giants were so loaded with talent that they knew they would be back in subsequent years. And that may have been the greatest Giants team ever. They won 902 games in the 1960s, more than in any other decade. Of course, some New York teams posted higher winning percentages, but that was an era of 154 game seasons. Mays and McCovey turned in MVP seasons. Mike McCormick won a Cy Young Award. Marichal never won it, despite winning more games in the 60s than any other pitcher. But the Dodgers and Cardinals were just as loaded with talent in that era. And we did not have a modern playoff system yet. It was simply win the pennant and go to the World Series. And the Giants posted 5 straight second place finishes and never made it back to the Classic. So, and as I'm looking at the decades, I think of the 1950s as the best of times and the worst of times. We had the miracle of Coogan's Bluff. We had Bobby Thompson's home run. The Giants win the pennant, followed by Mays' greatest season in 1954 with the incredible World Series that year, the upset over the Indians, Mays' catch. But this team then sank to the second division and ultimately left New York, which for you guys and for millions of others represented an all-time low. So I'm going to start my assessment of New York by looking at the very beginning. The Giants had some legendary teams in the 19th century. They posted their best 10-year winning percentage, .614, in the 1880s when they won 2 championships. And even now, looking at Baseball Reference, some of the all-time best WARs, their wins above replacement, if you look at these newfangled stats, were posted by 19th century Giants like Smiling Mickey Welch, Roger Connor, and Amos Russi, the Hoosier Thunderbolt, who was said to be the reason the pitching mound was moved from 50 feet away to 60 feet 6 inches. And I think all the strikeouts in today's game bolsters the argument for moving it a little farther yet. And we can talk about that later if you want. John McGraw took over the Giants in 1902, put his indelible stamp on the team and the game in the next 3 decades. A proponent of inside baseball, he moved players station to station with the Baltimore chop and the hit and run. And he won 10 pennants and 3 World Series over a 30-year span with the Giants. And it's almost funny to look back and think about it, but he refused to recognize the American League at first. The AL was paying players more, poaching players from the National League, the senior circuit. And so McGraw, even though the Giants won the pennant in 1904, he refused to play the American League in the World Series, and they sat it out. It would have been only the second World Series ever. So finally, there were some rule changes implemented, and the Giants played in 1905, and thank goodness, because that year, of course, Christy Mathewson turned in the greatest pitching performance in World Series history, something else we'll never see again. 3 shutouts as the Giants won the series 4-1 over the Philadelphia A's. But in that decade, in the original aughts, that was the Giants' only championship and their only World Series appearance. The 1910 squads, that in that decade, they had a .598 winning percentage and they won 4 pennants in 1911, 1912, 1913 and 1917, but they never won any of those World Series. They were the Buffalo Bills of their era. And the 1920s brought a real turnaround, and that's what gets my nod for the best decade in New York. The Giants roared into the 20s with 4 straight pennants and World Series titles in 1921 and 1922, falling just short in 23 and 24. It was those Giants that made the biggest contribution to the franchise's record 57 Hall of Famers, with High Pockets Kelly, Travis Jackson, Dave Beauty Bancroft, Freddie Lindstrom, so many people. Although some people have told me that Frankie Frisch, who was another Hall of Famer and star of that era, later served on the Hall of Fame's Veterans Committee, and he lobbied heavily for his teammates of that era. So some folks who might not have made it in otherwise, have slipped into the Hall of Fame that way. The 1930s were also another outstanding decade for the Giants. They won 868 games and 3 pennants, with Bill Terry taking over from McGraw as manager. Memphis Bill was the last National Leaguer to hit 400. They had Carl Hubble and Hal Schumacher and Freddie Fitzsimmons on the mound, and young Mel Ott came up later, ultimately setting a National League home run record that Mays later broke before Aaron passed Mays. And the Giants did win 1 World Series in the 30s, but they fell short when they ran into the Yankees, who managed to pair Lou Gehrig at the end of his career with Joe DiMaggio at the beginning of his, and just had some incredible teams. And in the 40s, of course, World War II years, and the Giants did set some records with the window breakers in 1947 and the great home runs they hit, but they disappointed overall with the first losing decade in the team's history. So, I said there's different metrics for different ways to look at what's the best decade. The 2010s had the most championships with 3. The 1910s and 1920s tied with the most pennants at 4. The 1960s had the most wins, and as I said, in the 1880s had the highest winning percentage. And I'll just note that our current decade is off to a pretty good start with the Giants, right? The overachievers of 2020 missed the playoffs by 1 game, and now in 2021, the Giants have surprised almost everybody in the baseball world with the best record in the majors. Everybody picked them to be trailing the Dodgers and Padres by double digits at this point. And so who knows what'll happen over the next few months. So, and I'll just close by saying, we know we're lucky to be Giants fans, even with all the hardships that we've suffered through. The team has pretty consistently fielded some great players and some memorable seasons. And they are the winningest team of all time, presumably in all of sports, with 11,261 wins, or maybe it's 11,262 if they just won now, which puts 180 up over those evil Dodgers. So whatever your favorite decade is, let's raise a toast to the orange and black. And thank you again for having me.
Yeah, great presentation. The book is fabulous. The Giants won, by the way, today, 5-4.
Right on.
So the book is great. I love the little pictures that you have in there with each of the years. Really fabulous, and your knowledge and expertise is wonderful. I got a question for you. Last year, and I know you do a lot of research. Last year, the Giants were going to retire Will Clark's number, and they changed it to this year, and it got canceled again because of COVID. So for the huge San Francisco fans, next year will be the year it will be retired. I look at stats also, and Will Clark, without a doubt, one of my all-time favorite San Francisco Giants. What do you think of Matt Williams possibly getting his number retired? What do you think?
It's an interesting question, Gary. I think the Giants, for a long time, the Giants were really holding out and were only retiring Hall of Famers
Right.
uniform numbers. And that was, there was a lot of fan sentiment for Clark. He came up with the Giants. He gave them so many great years. He was a real the face of the franchise in that era. And he's back with the team. He's been coaching, he's helping out. You see him around the ballpark, and I can see where they decided, to hang number 22 on the rafters for that. And just as one aside, when they were saying that about the Hall of Famers, I think one of the great things they did was in 2010, they retired Monty Irvin's number 20. And there had been some folks who had lobbied for that, and recognizing Irvin, of course, a great Negro leaguer, but who was really, helped integrate the Giants and help Mays come up and led the league in RBIs and is a tremendous Hall of Famer. And some people think that was the key that broke the curse in 2010 and opened up finally recognizing Irvin. But I kind of like that they have a pretty high standard. Matt Williams was a great player. Of course, he very well, if not for the strike in '94, he very well might have broken Roger Maris's record ahead of McGuire and Sosa. But I just don't know that Matt Williams had the length or the achievements with the Giants, even that Clark had, and that it would be right to start retiring numbers, because once you start going down that path, you start getting so many other people.
Totally agree. I was looking at it more of, they basically played the same amount of time with the franchise. And I know Williams, is not working with the team, and he helped the Diamondbacks win a World Championship. But I always, if the game was on the line, I'd want Clark up. And if the game was on the line, I'd want the ball hit to Matt Williams, because I know he'd make every play. But I appreciate your thoughts.
Yeah, and I if somebody someday wants to make a case to retire Tim Lincecum's 55, I'm probably going to be signing that petition, because the guy won 2 Cy's, and I think he also is really a big reason why they turned it around. In we know Buster will go to I'm pretty sure Buster should go to the Hall of Fame, and that'll be a no-brainer for the Giants. But yeah, I'll have to look at the numbers for Williams and Clark, and it's kind of interesting. But Will the Thrill had that intangible of
Great.
like I
Loved
said,
him.
Yeah.
Steve, you're up. Steve, go ahead. And then
you kind of answered the question on Posey, but I kind of agree with you, Dan. Matt Williams, he's now recognized more as a D-back down here in Arizona. Clark went back to the team, but Gary, you got it right in the head. Those two guys had a game face. They weren't sitting every other day, or my toe hurts me today. Can I go to can I sit in the clubhouse? I think they came face. But I think Matt Williams, the fact that he left in the World Series in Arizona and stuff. So, and Buster Posey, your answer is he's a Hall of Famer, and that was basically my question. So thank you.
All right, Mars, you're up, and then we got Craig Harris. Mars, unmute yourself, Mars.
If any, can you hear me now?
Yep.
Okay, if any number should be retired of a Giant that's not in the Hall of Fame, it should be 23 for Bobby Thompson, because that home run was, as we all feel, is the greatest impact homer in the game's history.
I love it. I can't argue with that. And of course that homer, I mean, Thompson doesn't get a plaque in the Hall of Fame, but that is enshrined in baseball history. That is just, it's the ringtone on my phone is Russ Hodges' call of that home run. So again, I won't argue with that, but I'll tell you what, with, seeing Chris Bryant putting on 23 this year gives me a pretty good feeling for the Giants. So that's been a lot of fun as well.
Thank you.
Dan, by the way, Brian had the game-winning hit in the 10th inning.
Yep.
Do you have some family or friends you want to say hi to who hopped aboard? I see
Oh,
Ken,
well,
Ken and maybe Mike Williams.
oh, great. Well, yeah, it's a nice, well,
Hey,
yeah, Mike is a good friend of mine in the Bay Area. And Ken, of course, is my dad. And my dad and mom, Ken and Marcy Fost, and my dad, I got a credit for making me a baseball fan and taking me to all those games back when I was growing up here in New Jersey in the 60s and 70s. And my son Harry, is here with them and here with all of us. So it's our, we haven't all gotten together in the same under one roof in almost 2 years, and it's just great to be with them and funny to be Zooming with them in the same house, but why not?
all right. Craig, you're up,
One
Craig.
other person, I'll just say hi to Rick Swig. I saw talking here, and I think we have a friend in common, Mike Zaidlin. So anyway, it was fun to hear Rick's stories about the memorabilia, because Mike's been telling me about Rick and some of his collection.
Yeah, Dan, the beauty of this whole thing is that, we were only a New York group because the meetings were in New York. Now we got people in Arizona and Florida and San Francisco, and Rick and Norm are always on. And it's just, this thing has really gotten really nice because we're all Giant fans in here, and it's nice.
No, I'm not.
Except for Frank. Frank's a stout.
Well, I got an announcement for the benefit. If there's any other Met fan here, the Phillies went ahead in the top of the ninth. They came from behind, they went ahead. Now the Nationals are batting, and if the Phillies win, the Mets will be
Oh,
a
thank
half
you.
game ahead.
All right, Craig Harris, go ahead.
Hey, Dan, thank you very much for joining us tonight and really enjoyed your breakdown decade by decade. I was curious, could you give us your top 3 Giants managers over the years?
Well, of course, I think, John McGraw is probably at the top of major league manager list. And even with the rap that, he struggled in the World Series and the big ones, 7 World Series losses, still to get there 10 times, to win 2,500 games, to win 3 World Series, and the impact he had on the game is just tremendous. And of course, right behind him, I'm going to put Bruce Bochy. For Bochy to take those teams and win 3 World Series, and he just always seemed to outmanage the guy in the other dugout. I think of those series with the Phillies in 2010, where he just made the right moves, the double switches, bringing in, if he brought in Lincecum in relief, or he, knew right where to put Javi Lopez to get Utley and Howard out. It was just tremendous. And I don't know that there's too many other. I can't believe that Bochy never won a Manager of the Year award with the Giants, given the very few superstars. I mean, he had a Buster Posey MVP season in there, but the way that he was able to just put the pieces in place, and so number 3 is the tough one, right? I mean, we think about, Dusty Baker had a good long run and won a pennant. Of course, Roger Craig turned the team around and won a pennant. Alvin Dark, Bill Rigney. I'm probably going to go back to Bill Terry and say, not only as a great player, but to take him to those series in the 30s and to win and to beat the Senators. The Giants were incredibly lucky. After McGraw, it was just one Hall of Famer after another managing the team, from Terry to Ott to Leo DeRocher.
Oh, sure.
DeRocher gets the asterisk as being a former Dodger, but other than that, you got to give him credit for the 51 pennant and the 54 title. So I'm gonna go with Terry as my number 3. But
That's great. Thank you very much.
We're going to go to Jeff, then John, and then Steve. Jeff Cohen, you're up.
Thanks, Gary. Dan, great talk. It's really interesting. What do you rank the greatest Giant shortstops? For some reason I'm particular to Chris Spire. I just happen to like the way he played. But what about the greatest Giant shortstops in your opinion?
Yeah, and are we talking San Francisco or, you know, I mean,
Anyone, any era.
anytime, and then, in San Francisco, I would say I'm probably partial to Omar Vizquel. And I know Omar's maybe hit some legal trouble lately, and I don't know, it might jeopardize his Hall of Fame chances. The guy was just an incredible, defensive whiz for so long, and I think we were lucky to have him, and he won some Gold Gloves in San Francisco, and he was a steady bat as well. And now, of course, we're incredibly lucky to have Brandon Crawford, and I think he very well might go down as as the greatest, certainly in the San Francisco era. This is his 10th season with the Giants. He still surprises us sometimes with showing some good at bats and holds his own at the plate. But he's one of those guys from he's one of those guys who we take for granted. I think in an earlier era it was routine to see the good field no hit shortstops, the Mark Belangers or the Aparicios, but Crawford, my son who knows the stats even better than me, just texted to say Crawford set the franchise record for games played at shortstop this year. So I think we got to give props to Crawford. Spire was awesome, especially in an otherwise relatively bleak era. Travis Jackson was a Hall of Famer and shortstop on those Giants teams in the 20s. So he's the one other guy that I would mention. And in a lot of ways, the Giants turned around in the late 40s when DeRocher came over and got rid of all the, he didn't like those big lumbering hitters, the Johnny Mizes and the Walker Coopers. And he brought in Alvin Dark and Eddie Stanky at short and second. And they were some of the real keystones to that 1951 pennant winner.
Hey, Jeff.
Thank you. Yes.
I was very, very upset when the Giants decided to trade Chris Spire to the Expos for Tim Foley.
Mhm.
I was, well, when the Giants got good in '87, they brought Spire back, and he was a big part of their winning.
Yep.
Really, he was great utility man when he came back. So let's go to John. John?
Hey, Dan, great talk. Just a quick question. The championships in the 1880s, how do those count? Are they similar to the Cleveland Browns have won the NFL championship but never won the Super Bowl? Or are they in a different category, or do they count with the World Series titles?
Yeah, that's a good question. I'm not sure I know enough to really say where that ranks, but I mean, of course, it's a much smaller league back then. Mm-hmm. And it was an interesting time. I think it was because then, as I recall, the players, it's been a while since I've looked at it, but the players led by John Montgomery Ward, who was not only their shortstop, but he was a lawyer, and he started the first players union, and they bolted and started this players association, and it broke up the team. But I think that those were some pretty damn good teams. They said Buck Ewing, the catcher, and I think he might have managed them for a while, but he was supposed to be the greatest athlete of the 19th century. And of course, baseball was the professional sport in America during those years. So, and I don't, I think obviously you have all these different eras of baseball, the World Series era starting with the American League in 1901, and then this modern era, the kind of the post-expansion era, and all these playoff games, which changed the equation again. But so it's fun. I'll have to play a Stratomatic game or something to see how the 1880s teams stack up against some of these more modern teams.
Steve, you're up.
Yeah, you briefly went over Alvin Dark. He kind of gets shortchanged for, I guess, various reasons. I'm not going to go into that. But if you look at his stats compared to Rizzuto and Reese, they're comparable and maybe better in some categories. His name never comes up for Cooperstown. I hear that the big push this year is going to be for Gil Hodges. My question to you is, Bochy, what year is he eligible? I knew that. And is it this year?
I wouldn't, I don't, is it, I'm not necessarily sure if there's different rules for managers or if he has to wait 5 years. Because it is funny to see Tony La Russa, getting in the hall and then coming back.
Yeah.
Coming back and I wouldn't be surprised to see Bochy come back. I think, he loves the game and he loves to manage but he's got a pretty good life too, and he's had some heart issues. So, I think he's probably relieved that he wasn't managing during this pandemic for sure. But I would think that Bochy's a lock to get in. He's any manager with the number of pennants, with the 3 World Series, with I think that he falls just short lifetime of a 500 record. But he won a pennant with San Diego. He was manager of the year. There's no doubt in my mind the guy is a Hall of Fame manager.
Thank you.
Anybody else with another question?
Yeah, I just wanted to comment that a couple of other great, I believe they were shortstops, Dick Bartell and Dave Bancroft, and another pitcher of the 1930s. They called it the Big Four. My pop passed this information on to me because he worked for Harry M. Stevens when the Giants were home in the Polo Grounds. And then when they were on the road, he worked in Yankee Stadium. So he saw Ruth and Garrick, he saw Ott and Terry. But the Big Four, you mentioned Hubble, you mentioned Hal Schumacher, Fat Fetty, Fritz Simmons, Leroy Parmalee was part of that Big Four. So those stories were passed on to me. And the greatest story of all of that year is Hubble in the first game of a doubleheader pitched an 18-inning shutout against Tex Carlton, went the distance, of course, and didn't walk a batter. I think in the second game, the Cardinals beat the Giants 1-0 with Dizzy Dean. And that was kind of almost replicated by Juan Marichal, which he threw over 200 pitches in 16 innings and beat Warren Spahn, who went the distance. So, those days are long gone with starting pitchers pitching complete games and then extra inning games too. So that's what I miss most in baseball. But a question I have for you is the steroid era. Do you think really Bonds ever deserves to go to the Hall of Fame?
I absolutely do. I mean, I think that, and it's impossible to sort out that era and to say who was and wasn't doing what. And, and we know that there were pitchers who were on steroids and Bonds was still hitting them. Bonds was still putting on and first of all, Bonds was a Hall of Famer without steroids, right? I mean, he was already, he would already won all those MVP awards. There was no doubt that for years he was the best player in baseball. And then to see him being the home run king, single season, career home run king, 232 walks in a season. I mean, I felt like I was watching Babe Ruth going to those games. Nobody left their seat when Bonds was up. So to me, it's pretty sad that he's not in the Hall of Fame. And I hate to see that it's the writers who are put in that position of trying to be moral judges, especially with someone like Bonds, who maybe didn't technically even break the rules of baseball, wasn't suspended, wasn't banished from the game. So why should somebody be, I just say put him in the game. He did what he did. He was on the field. He's in the record books, and I think he belongs in the Hall.
Well, do you think there should be a separate category? Like originally there was the asterisk for Roger Maris, which of course was eventually eliminated. But, like here's a guy that would have never, and this goes for McGuire and Sosa too, would have amassed those numbers without the steroid issue. Because it's not like taking bennies at all. I have a big issue with it.
I understand that, and it is especially unfortunate to stack up. I mean, I think number one, sure, I'm glad that baseball has cleaned that up. I think it was terrible that, especially the pressure young players felt to have to take that stuff in order to get there, to get to the big leagues. You know, and I think it's unfortunate that, you know, people's records were broken that wouldn't have been broken. I mean, there's no way Bonds would have broken Aaron's record without steroids. I mean, I'm sure of that. But at the same time, it just seems to me too hard to unravel it and to start. And if you want to put it on the guy's plaque, or you want to, you know, I mean, I've heard that argument for Rose or for others, you know, if you want to, you know, but it seems hard to start. Are we going to start going back through baseball history and trying to determine, you know, if somebody finds out that Babe Ruth took some kind of sheep testosterone, or if somebody did something, is that tainted? I just think it's too hard to start picking these things apart. If it turns out, you know, not even guys from the steroid era who we believe didn't take it, like whether it's Mike Piazza or Jim Thome are in the Hall of Fame, are we going to, you know, how do you start sorting that out? I just
Can't.
you know, I think it's too hard.
Thank you.
Dan, I got a quick question for you. We seem to have run into this wonderful problem with possibly having elite catchers going Posey, and then they drafted Joey Bart and Bailey. And you were talking about decades before, and I remember that in the 1970s all-decade team, the catcher was Mike Sadek, and he was basically a part-timer. And I mean, think about that you have a part-time catcher as your best catcher for a decade, and now you're being spoiled in the 10s by Buster Posey, and then in the 20s, if these catchers amount to anything, you might have a nice long run of fabulous catchers.
It would be great. I mean, you know, for the Giants, first base was that position that there were just so many incredible first basemen over the years, and you could go back to Roger Connor in the 19th century and High Pockets Kelly in the 1920s, and then of course, you know, and John, and then, you know, this golden era where then they had Covey and Cepeda at the same time, and really probably it's what killed them was having to, you know, trade of Cepeda was for Ray Sadecki was just one that will live in infamy. So you know, and going on to Will Clark, JT Snow, even this long run with Brandon Belt, where I know a lot of people have different opinions of the guy, but you know, they won 2 titles with him at first base. I think it's, you know, for the, you know, whereas maybe for the Yankees it was Bill White. Thanks, Jan. I think you had so many, so it'd be great to see that same kind of run. It's fun to see, you know, and maybe that's lit a little fire under Buster, or Buster finally, you know, taking 2020 off. He's been able to come back and have a great year. There were some people speculating, you know, Bart's name was coming up in a lot of trade talks this year, that now that you see Buster can play half a year. But, you know, if they go to a universal DH, you know, and you can have Buster catch half the games and still have his bat, they'll, you know, and let him bring Bart along and not, you know, and let Bart catch half the games for a couple of years. I'm fine with that. That'd be great.
Totally agree. Craig, you're up again.
The Phillies lost. The Mets are only a half game ahead now.
Go ahead,
Hey,
Craig.
Dan, I wanted to see if you could talk a little bit about Jeff Kent and his legacy with the Giants and how you think he stacks up against other Giants second basemen over the years.
Yeah, and Kent is an interesting one. I mean, and he and I think there's been a lot of debate about whether he belongs in the Hall of Fame. He's certainly one of the better hitting second basemen of his era. Won an MVP award. Boy, I've got you got to think about to shift gears. And you know, one of the things, you know, in fact, I was just thinking when we were talking about Bochy, you know, something else, as those 3 World Series teams, they won the World Series. each year they had a different second baseman. The second baseman was always the number 2 hitter. They had a different center fielder who was always the leadoff hitter. They had a different, different ace pitcher, different closer, but they still managed to move it all around. So I think it was kind of fun in those years. I loved seeing Joe Panic win a Gold Glove and come up as a rookie, a native New Yorker, East Coast guy. And, I loved what Freddie Sanchez did in 2010. Robbie Thompson, I think, will always be one of my favorite Giants. The second baseman on those. We talked about Clark and Mike Williams, not my friend in San Anselmo, but Giant Mike Williams. So I think Kent is really, he's on that Hall of Fame bubble, but he's probably the best second baseman in the Giants San Francisco era.
Why do you think he gets such a lack of support for Hall of Fame voting? I don't understand that.
No, and it's I don't know if it was the longevity or if people felt that I know I might be freezing up here, but people felt like he was hitting in front of Bonds and that gave him I don't really understand the the lack of love for Kent. Maybe it was his defense, but boy, I loved it when he was on the Giants and batting in the 3-hole.
Totally agree. Ed Freer, you're up.
Yeah, just a question, a little bit off site, but he mentioned the hot button to me on the DH. I haven't seen many Giant games this year, but I was watching the Dodger Giant game a week or so when Cueto was running to space, and I thought that was a highlight of the year. I don't know how many people. And what is
that game
changing records in DH?
I'm with you completely. I mean, and Cueto's had a couple of times on the base paths, and it's just been fantastic. And it just adds so much more strategy. It just was, and again, going back to say Bochy managing in those playoffs and seeing, the double switches and the way the whole chess game that National League ball allows. I'm not rooting for it by any means. I did mention it, and I do feel like it's coming, but they keep trying to obliterate the differences between the leagues. But I love having I love National League ball and the pitcher hitting. I'd rather the American League dump the DH, but I don't think that's ever going to happen.
Yeah.
Well, isn't there another alternative, having only 8 batters?
Oh, I can't imagine that's going to happen, right? Is the symmetry of the 9s, the 9 innings, the 9 hitters, I think it's the 3 strikes, the 3 outs. It's just too good. I'd like to see, I mentioned the pitching mound. I'd like to see the mound put right smack in the center of the diamond and let the pitchers figure it out.
Mars, before we get to you, you've asked a few questions. I just want to make sure. Does anybody else have a question before I let Mars ask another question? Just trying to get as many people involved as possible. We good? Okay, Mars, you're up.
Yeah, the other day, while watching the Giants game, Mike Krukow and Dave Fleming were mentioning that they were actually in favor of the DH, especially for the Giants, because Gosman couldn't lay down a bunt. But isn't it up to the coaches and the managers to force the pitchers to teach them how to put the bat on the ball? Why blame the pitchers if the managers and coaches are not drilling them to teach them how to do it? It's very simple, actually.
Well, that's a good point. That's a fair point. I'm not gonna. First of all, I'm not going to get in a baseball argument with Mike Krukow or Dave Fleming, because those guys are just so great and know so much about the game. I would like to think that the pitchers would have enough pride in what they do, that if they're not going to be able to hit, they're at least going to learn how to bunt or do something, and make that a part of their game.
Thank you.
Sure, thank you.
Steve, you have another question?
No, I'm good. That's it.
Anybody else with a question? Dan's given us close to an hour now.
Thank you.
Okay, Gary.
Andrew, go ahead.
Yeah, I'll try one. First of all,
Yes,
Dan,
sir.
it was such a great overview. I'm trying to think where I could jump in. And I think I have something. The announcers. What greats over the years. You mentioned Russ Hodges, Lon Simmons, Hank Greenwald, whom we've talked about, John Miller, Kruko, and Kuiper. I just want to add about Russ Hodges. I think it was Marischal's no-hitter, and Lon Simmons had never called one, and Russ was the primary guy. He said, Lon, you take it. Could you imagine Sterling or even Vince Scully? I know he walks on water, but he's got an ego the size of China. I don't know about him allowing the other guy to do it as well.
Very good point.
That is a great story. That is a great story. Yeah, I mean, we've just been so lucky as Giants fans, and you know, much of the way I experience the game is on the radio and listening to those guys, and their knowledge of the game and their ability to paint the picture, especially this current group, the four guys that have been through it all these years. It's just fantastic. I've just been we are truly blessed.
Thank you.
Steve, go ahead.
Yeah, just to jump in on Andy's point, those of us from New York at the time, when the Giants left, I know we've discussed this, we used to turn on WINS and got Les Kiter to recreate the game.
Yeah.
Say something. There was
Another
nothing
great
like
one.
that. He beat the ball. Remember that?
Another
You should
great
see him run, and it was terrific. And you had it on the radio, on the radio, as they said.
With sound effects. And
Correct.
and he struck him out.
Yeah. Right.
And that's a real skill. He's reading it off a piece of paper. I mean, how that guy did that is just fantastic.
There was some times where it was screwed up, and I remember him saying it. He had to ad lib, but he was wonderful. Also
Yeah.
announced the Knick games live. Yeah, he was a good guy.
Dan, what would need to be done for you to update this book?
Yeah, well, Gary, I was telling you, you know, I would have thought the Giants winning a World Series is what we need, because you know, but even when that happened, my publisher had gone out of business. You know, and we tried a couple different angles on trying to get a new book out to celebrate the 2014 champs. So I don't know, maybe this will be the year. Maybe this will be the year the Giants win in an odd year. And maybe picking up an ex-Cub, Chris Bryant will help bring it along, and who knows, I'll get another book out of the deal. But I've just been so lucky to get to write about the Giants. You know, the last few years I've gotten to do a lot of work. They had a magazine, the program Giants magazine, that they sold at the ballpark. They had actually just pulled the plug on the magazine before the 2020 season, but I'm hoping maybe if the team starts winning and people come back, there might be a way to get that back. Because it was a lot of fun, and there's just so many stories in baseball to tell. And that's one of the things I just love about the game is all the stories there are. So,
You know, your love affair with the 3 World Championships. There are two guys who I think were really totally underrated during the reign. One won three rings, the other one 2. Very underrated. I don't think they would have won without him. One is Javi Lopez, and the other was Gregor Blanco. I think those two guys, very underrated, and were really winning ball players.
How about Rich Uria?
Who?
Rich Uria, the shortstop who had 200 hits. Rich Uria.
Rich
For
Aurelia?
real.
He wasn't
Renteria.
on. He wasn't on.
10.
no, Edgar Renteria,
2010.
he's talking
Oh,
about, who had the
He had a home run. That was about
MVP of
it.
the 2010. Yeah, he's kind of almost forgotten, but he won the MVP of the 2010 series, and you know, he lit it up on a big stage. I agree completely. I mean, in fact, the 4 guys in the bullpen, you know, and to me, I thought you were going to say Jeremy Affeldt, because to me, he was the guy, and he was the guy Bochy would bring in the second inning if he had to in those big games, and he was, you know, nerves of steel.
Yeah, the reason I didn't say Affeldt was because I think the Giants expected him. You know, they picked up Lopez from the Pirates, you know, as a loogie, and he turned. You know,
Yep.
all I remember Howard and Utley. These guys never got hits off of him.
Everyone.
Yeah.
And
Every team that goes big-
Blanco was fabulous instead of, except that one play when Perez started to play soccer, you know.
Right.
I was like, pick up the damn ball already. I mean, come on. But two very underrated Giants who went a long way to helping them win.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, and but I was just going to say that bullpen of, with Sergio Romo and Santiago Casilla and Affeldt and Lopez, I mean, they're great. And Lopez is now broadcasting some of the games, and he's just great. He went to UVA. He's a very smart guy, and very articulate and fun to talk to. So he was always a guy I loved to go up to in the clubhouse, because he always would have something intelligent to say. So, yeah. But there were a lot of unsung heroes there.
Anybody else a final comment or question?
I have a question comment. Two things. We have a little campaign going on with our group to augment the name of Oracle Park with Willie Mays Field at Oracle Park. And we had Larry Bear as a guest. And according to what we found out, it was brought up. It may not happen this year because of the pandemic and all the other priorities. The other, so what do you feel about that? And second part is, do you feel Horace Stoneham deserves to go to the Hall of Fame?
I'm glad you said that, because we were talking about the Hall of Fame and different people. I wanted to mention Stoneham. I think he absolutely belongs in the Hall of Fame. And, I think there was a lot of people who didn't take him that seriously through the years, or don't really recall. And I know there's been some new books about him, and I hope that helps burnish his reputation. I mean, he brought baseball to the West Coast. The guy had a lifelong love of the game. He owning one of the game's marquee franchises for as long as he did. And I think he absolutely deserves a spot in the Hall. And maybe now that, we were pretty cynical when Jacob Rupert got put in. It seemed like that was just greasing the wheels for Steinbrenner to get put in. And absolutely, Horace Stoneham belongs in if those guys are in my opinion.
But here's a man that lost him in two cities.
Right. Well, he did sell the team to Bob Lurie, and Bob Lurie did keep him in San Francisco. So I'm not gonna castigate Stoneham for San Francisco, but I should know this, but if Walter O'Malley gets in, that we should, the two of them should go in together. So and as
O'Malley is in.
Yeah. See, and so why would that be when and Stoneham isn't? And Stoneham also did so much to integrate the game and to bring in Latin players in the 1950s.
Training, Arizona.
Spring training. And spring training in Arizona. So I think, he was an innovator as well, and deserves credit. And as for Mays Field, to me, that's a no-brainer, and they have to do it. And I just hope they do it while Willie's still alive. The guy is clearly a national treasure, and they've certainly have honored him at the ballpark. But I would have loved, there was a group in San Francisco that, we've had say Mays Field bumper stickers. It never should have been named after a phone company or a tech company. It's at 24 Willie Mays Plaza. The walls are 24 feet high. There's 24 palm trees out in front of it. And they should just name the field Mays Field. They shouldn't even have to think about it.
Well, that's what Larry Bear said. But I said the precedent for this is Ricky Henderson Field at O.Co Stadium. So even if it's not inlaid in concrete, it could be like the World Series and All-Star emblems behind home plate painted on there. It could be a spot on the scoreboard while he's still alive, so he could really appreciate it.
Yeah. Amen.
Thank you.
Dan, we cannot thank you enough. What a great chat, and really, thank you so much. Give it up for Dan. Dan, please come back. Not even as a speaker, just join.
Yeah,
the
I
crowd.
will. I will. I get your emails, Gary. This is really fun. This is a great group. You guys ask tremendous questions. It's clear you have passion and knowledge about the game, and it was a great night for me. So thank you so much.
Give it up for Dan.
Thank you,
Yay.
Dan, very much.
All
Thank
right,
you.
Dan, I'll give you a buzz to thank you, but have a great rest of your vacation here on the East Coast. And I will stay in the room until we close it down. Good night, everybody.
All right.
You know, Gary, I'm reading Gregor's
Dan.
book